To understand the woman who would one day save the soul of Mongolia, we must first understand the world that forged her. It was a world of vanishing glory, where the memory of Genghis Khan was fading into the dust of the steppe, threatened by betrayal from within and pressure from without. Mandukhai was born into this precarious reality around 1448 or 1449. She was not a commoner born to tend flocks in obscurity. She was a child of the highest aristocracy, brought into the world with the weight of history already resting on her shoulders. She was the only daughter of Chorosbai Tumur, the Ching Sang, or Grand Counselor of the Ongud tribe. In the complex tapestry of Mongol tribal politics, the Ongud were not merely another clan roaming the grasslands. They were the guardians. For centuries, they had patrolled the northern borders of China, acting as the shield of the empire. But more importantly, they held a sacred blood pact with the golden lineage of Genghis Khan. Since the days of the great conqueror himself, the Ongud had been granted the supreme privilege of the Guragan, the imperial sons-in-law. This meant that for generations, Ongud men had married Borjigan princesses, and Ongud women had birthed future Khans. To be born Ongud was to be born into the inner circle of imperial power. This unique heritage granted Mandukhai an education that was denied to most women of her time. Her father, Chorosbai Tumur, did merely raise a daughter to be a wife. He raised a strategist. In the felt tense of her childhood, she absorbed the nuances of diplomacy, the geometry of war, and the intricate, often deadly, genealogy of the steppe elite. She learned that blood was currency, and in the fractured landscape of the Northern Yuan, it was the only currency that held its value. But the Northern Yuan dynasty she grew up in was a shell of its former self. By 1464, when Mandukhai was 16 years old, the empire was teetering on the brink of total collapse. It was in this year that her destiny began to take shape. In a strategic maneuver designed to bind the powerful Ongud tribe closer to the failing throne, the teenage Mandukhai was married to Mongol Khan. Mandul was the ruler of the Northern Yuan, but he was a man besieging by time and enemies. He was aging, his health was declining, and his grip on the fractious tribes was slipping. For a 16-year-old girl, entering Mandul's court must have been like stepping into a den of wolves. She was not the Khan's only wife. She entered the royal encampment in the shadow of Ye Kabartu, the Khan's first wife. However, the dynastic politics of the steppe are ruthless, and biology is often destiny. Ye Kabartu, despite her high status, had failed in the one duty that mattered most. She had produced no sons. Mandukhai, young, intelligent, and possessing the sharp political acumen of her father, quickly navigated the treacherous currents of the harem. She did not remain a silent consort. She rapidly gained the favor of the aging Khan, not just through her youth, but through her intellect. She became a confidant, a voice of reason in a court filled with madness. While she eventually gave birth to daughters, securing her place in the family, but not yet solving the succession crisis, her real power lay in her growing influence over state affairs. She began to see the cracks in the empire from the inside out, and the widest crack of all had a name: Ismail Taishi. If Mandukhai represented the loyalty and tradition of the old empire, Ismail Taishi represented the chaotic, mercenary New World Order. Ismail was a formidable warlord, a Muslim chieftain whose ambition was matched only by his cunning. In the official records, he appears as a destabilizing force, a man who played the Game of Thrones with a poisoned dagger. Many historians believe he was acting as a double agent, a de facto spy for the Ming Dynasty of China. The Ming, terrified of a resurgent Mongol threat, employed a strategy of divide and conquer, and Ismail was their perfect instrument. Ismail's goal was simple and horrific: to prune the golden lineage until no one was left to rally the tribes. He insinuated himself into the court, manipulating the paranoia of the aging Mandul Khan. But his true target was not the old Khan, it was the future, the rightful heir to the throne. A man named Bayan Monkeyjonon stood in Ismail's way. Bayan Mongke was the hope of the Borjigin line, the father of the future Dayan Khan. But in the lawless atmosphere of the late 15th century, hope was a dangerous thing to hold. Ismail Taishi orchestrated a campaign of isolation and violence against Bayan Mongke. Through intrigue and brute force, Ismail hounded the rightful heir, eventually cornering and murdering him. The death of Bayan Mongke was a catastrophe. It was not just a political assassination. It was a blow that nearly severed the artery of the great Mongol nation. With the heir dead and Mandukhai Khan aging without a son, the stage was set for a dark age of unprecedented chaos. This was the terrifying reality that Mandukhai watched unfold from the side of the throne. She saw the guardians of her own tribe sidelined. She saw the legitimacy of her husband, the Khan, hollowed out by the machinations of a foreign warlord. She saw the rightful heir butchered, leaving the line of Genghis Khan dangling by a thread. By the time the dust settled on these early years, Mandukhai was no longer the innocent 16-year-old girl from the Ongud tribe. She had been forged in the fires of court intrigue. She understood that the northern Yuan was dying, poisoned from within by men like Ismail. As the sun set on the reign of Mandukhai Khan, Mandukhai stood alone in the gathering dark, realizing that if the empire was to be saved, it would not be by the men who had let it crumble. It would require a strength that the steppe had not seen since the days of the Golden Horde. The crisis was here, and the daughter of the gatekeepers was the only one left standing at the gate. The year 1479 marked the moment the Northern Yuan Dynasty should have died. The prophecy of doom that had hung over the steppe finally seemed to come true. Mandukhai Khan, the aging ruler Mandukhai had served and advised, collapsed and died. The historical records are murky on the exact cause. Some whisper of natural illness, while others point to the subtle, poisonous hand of Ismail Taishi's faction. But the cause mattered less than the catastrophic result. The throne was empty, and the royal tent was silent. Mandukhai died without a male heir. In the brutal mathematics of the steppe, a king without a son is not a tragedy. It is an extinction event. His first wife, Yeke Kabaratu, vanished from the record almost immediately, likely fleeing for her life or silenced by the knives of the warlords. Suddenly, at roughly 30 years old, Mandukhai stood alone at the center of a swirling vortex of ambition and violence. She was a widow in a land that had no mercy for the weak, the last visible pillar of a crumbling house. The wolves were not just at the door, they were inside the room. The warlords, led by the treacherous Ismail, were ready to carve up the carcass of the empire. They believed the line of Genghis Khan, the golden lineage, was finally severed. They were wrong. There was one spark left, hidden deep in the wilderness. Living in the shadow of fear was a child. His name was Batmunk. He was the 7-year-old son of the murdered heir Bayan Mongke, the boy whose father Ismail had hunted down. But this was not a prince in a palace. When Mandukhai's scouts finally located him, they found a tragedy. The boy had been abandoned, surviving on the charity of commoners. The chronicles describe a heartbreaking sight, a child ravaged by rickets, his skin covered in sores and scabies, his belly swollen from malnutrition, dressed in rags that barely kept out the wind. This broken, sickly child was the Khagan, the rightful emperor of the Mongols. He was the last drop of Genghis Khan's blood on the face of the earth. If he died, the divine mandate ended forever. Mandukhai faced a choice that would tear most souls apart. It was a choice between her survival as a woman and her duty as a queen. Entering the stage was General Unubold. He was everything the boy Batmunk was not a grown man. A seasoned commander, and a warrior of immense physical strength. Unubold traced his lineage to Tasird, the brother of Genghis Khan. While this meant he was nobility, he was not of the direct imperial line. He could be a king, but never the great Khan. Unubold approached the young widow with a proposal. In the Mongol tradition of the leveret, it was customary for a widow to marry a male relative of her late husband to preserve the family property and status. Unubold offered Mandukhai his hand in marriage. It was a seductive offer. Marrying Unubold meant instant protection. It meant the loyalty of his army. It meant Mandukhai could live out her days in safety, wealth, and power as the wife of a mighty warlord. All she had to do was let the line of Genghis Khan die with the sick boy in the wilderness. Logic dictated she take the general. History demanded she take the child. In a move that stunned the steppe, Mandukhai turned her back on safety. The Altan Tobshi Chronicle captures this moment with a spiritual intensity that transcends mere politics. Mandukhai traveled to the Ordos region, to the sacred precincts of the Ancient Koru, the Lord's enclosure. This was the shrine of the 8 white yurts, the mobile mausoleum that housed the spirit and relics of Genghis Khan himself. Imagine the scene, a solitary woman standing before the felt tents that held the soul of her nation. She was not there to ask for a husband. She was there to consecrate a dynasty. Mandukhai performed a ritual that was equal parts prayer and political manifesto. She poured an offering of milk to the eternal blue sky and spoke to the spirit of the great conqueror. She swore an oath that reverberated across the centuries. She vowed to reject the powerful Unibold. She vowed to adopt the diseased, abandoned orphan Batmonk. She would be his mother, his nurse, his protector. And when the time was right, his wife, she declared, "I will knot my black hair at the back of my head. I will place the jade seal upon this child. I will brave the hardships of the state to restore the Great Yuan." It was a declaration of war against the status quo. She was betting her life on a dying boy. But the most incredible part of this saga was not just her decision, but the reaction of General Unibold. When Mandukhai descended from the shrine and announced her intent to rule as regent for the boy Khan, Unibold did not draw his sword in anger. He did not seize the throne by force, which he easily could have done. Instead, humbled by her courage and bound by the ancient reverence for the golden lineage, the great general bowed. He pledged his loyalty to Mandukhai and the sickly child. In that moment, Mandukhai achieved her first great victory without firing a single arrow. She had used the moral weight of tradition to disarm a potential usurper. She took the boy Batmonk into her own tent. She cleaned his sores, fed him, and nursed him back from the brink of death. She named him Dayan Khan, the Khan of the Great Yuan. She was no longer just a widow. She was the regent of the empire. The Dark Age was not over. But for the first time in a century, a light had been lit in the darkness. Mandukhai had saved the heir. Now, she had to save the kingdom. With the spiritual mandate of the shrine secured and the loyalty of General Unibold affirmed, Mandukhai shifted her focus from survival to vengeance. She had the boy, Dayan Khan, safely in her tent and under her care. The sickly child began to transform. The sores healed, the malnutrition faded, and the strength of his ancestors began to show in his frame. But Mandukhai knew that a healthy heir was useless if he ruled over a graveyard. The man who had orphaned him, Ismail Taishi, was still out there, prowling the steppes like a wolf who scents blood. Ismail was not just a political rival. He was the executioner of the Borjigin family. As long as he drew breath, Dayan Khan would never be safe, and the Eastern Mongols would remain a fractured, terrified people. Mandukhai realized that to be the mother of a nation, she first had to be its avenger. She could not afford to govern from behind a silk screen. The time for diplomacy had ended. The time for steel had begun. In a move that shattered the gender norms of her era, Mandukhai donned the heavy armor of a commander. She did not send Unibold to do her dirty work. She mounted her horse, signaled the war drums, and personally led the army of the Eastern Mongols out of the encampment. She rallied the Keshikten tribe, the imperial guards, reminding them of their ancient duty to the golden lineage. It was a sight that must have terrified her enemies of Khatun. Riding at the head of a vengeance army, carrying the banner of a 7-year-old boy. The campaign against Ismail Taishi was swift and brutal. Mandukhai proved she was not merely a figurehead, she was a tactician. She hunted Ismail across the vast, unforgiving terrain, cutting off his escape routes and isolating his forces. The chronicles record this not as a skirmish, but as a glorious victory. Mandukhai smashed Ismail's power base, shattering his army and forcing the traitorous warlord to flee for his life. Ismail escaped the battlefield, running to the Western territories. But his power was broken. He would eventually die a pathetic death at the hands of local rivals. A fugitive in the land he once sought to rule. With Ismail gone, the internal rot was excised. Mandukhai had reclaimed the right wing of the Mongols, bringing the rebellious tribes back under the direct control of the central court. She had proven to the skepticism of the steppe that a woman could hold the sword of Genghis Khan without her hand trembling. But peace was a fleeting luxury. As the years passed, the dynamic within the royal tent shifted. Yuan Khan was no longer a child. He was growing into a man, forged by Mandukhai's tutelage. Around 1481 or 1483, when Dian was approaching adulthood, Mandukhai fulfilled the second half of her oath. She officially married the young Khan. To modernize, this union is complex, but in the context of the 15th century steppe, it was the ultimate act of statecraft. It was not a marriage of romance, but of legitimacy. By marrying him, Mandukhai prevented any other noble family from infiltrating the royal line. She made herself the sole vessel of the dynasty. This union solidified her position. She was no longer just the regent. She was the Khatun, the co-ruler, and the mother of the future. And she would need every ounce of that authority. For while the East was pacified, the West was gathering like a storm. The Oirats, the Western Mongol Confederation, watched Mandukhai's rise with contempt. They were the warriors who had captured the Chinese emperor decades earlier. They feared no one. Certainly not a female ruler and her boy husband. The Oirat chieftains refused to acknowledge Yuan Khan's supremacy. They raided the borderlands, burned eastern encampments, and openly mocked the golden lineage. They were the final obstacle to a unified Mongolia. Mandukhai understood that there could be no two suns in the sky. As long as the Oirats remained independent and hostile, the Great Yuan was a fantasy. She turned her eyes west. She was now in her 30s, a seasoned veteran of political and military wars. She was also, by this time, pregnant with Yuan Khan's children. Most queens would have retreated to the safety of the birthing tent. Mandukhai, however, ordered her saddle to be prepared. She knew that the coming battle would not just require soldiers, it would require a symbol. She would lead the charge herself, carrying the future of the dynasty in her womb. Riding into the teeth of the Oirat war machine, the stage was set for the Battle of Tasird, the crucible where the legend of the warrior mother would be forged in blood. The year 1479 marked the moment the sky seemed to fall on the northern Yuan dynasty. Mongol Khan, the ruler Mandukhai served, died suddenly. The historical consensus points to a dark conclusion. He was likely poisoned or assassinated by the faction of Ismail Taishi. But the cause of death was less important than the catastrophe it triggered. Mandul died without a male heir. This was a constitutional crisis of the highest order. His first wife, Yeke Kabartu, vanished from the historical record immediately following his death, likely fleeing into obscurity or silenced by the knives of the usurpers. This left Mandukhai, roughly 30 years old, standing alone against a pack of wolves. She was no longer just a queen consort. She was the last obstacle between the warlords and the throne. At that moment, the direct lineage of Genghis Khan, the Kublaids, had been hunted to the brink of extinction. Ismail Taishi's purges had been terrifyingly effective. However, amidst the despair, scouts brought Mandukhai a piece of intelligence that changed everything. There was a survivor, Batmunk, the 7-year-old son of the murdered heir, Bayan Mongke, was found alive. But this was no prince living in luxury. He was a tragedy. When he was discovered, the boy was living in abject poverty, hiding from Ismail's hitmen. He was described as a broken child suffering from severe rickets, his skin covered in scabies and sores, an abandoned orphan on the run. Finding and protecting this sick child was not merely an act of humanitarian compassion. It was the most critical political chess move of the century. If Batmunk survived, the empire had a heart. If he died, the legacy of Genghis Khan died with him. It was in this chaos that General Unabold stepped forward. A powerful and courageous commander from the lineage of Tasird, Genghis Khan's brother Unabold, offered Mandukhai a way out. He proposed marriage. Under the ancient Mongol custom of the leveret, it was standard practice for a widow to marry a relative or powerful figure to secure her property and status. If Mandukhai accepted Unabold, she would have gained immediate safety, a massive army, and unquestioned power. But there was a catch. Unabold was not of the direct Khagan lineage. Any children they had would possess no legitimate claim to the throne. To say yes to Unabold was to sign the death warrant of the Great Yuan Dynasty. Mandukhai made a decision that shook the steppe. She rejected the safety of the general to walk a razor's edge. According to the Altan Topshi Chronicle, she traveled to the shrine of the 8 white yurts, Ejen Koru, in the Ordos region, the sacred sanctuary housing the spirit of Genghis Khan. There, she performed a ritual of immense political weight. She prayed to her ancestors, swearing an oath that she would not remarry for safety, but would instead dedicate her life to raising the sick orphan bat monk. She declared herself regent, the supreme representative of the Khan's will. The most shocking aftermath of this decision was the reaction of General Unabold. Instead of rebelling, which he had the military might to do, he respected her choice. He swore his absolute loyalty to Mandukhai and the child Khan. This act demonstrated Mandukhai's immense personal prestige and the sacred weight the golden lineage still carried in the Mongol psyche. From 1480 to 1483, Mandukhai began the work of reconstruction. She brought Batmonk into her own tent, nursing him back to health, curing his rickets and skin diseases. She formally enthroned him with the title Dayan Khan. The name Dayan is believed to be derived from the Chinese Dayuan, Great Yuan, signaling her ambition to not just rule a tribe, but to restore the imperial glory that once spanned China and the steppe. Since Dayan was only 7 years old, absolute military and political power rested in Mandukhai's hands. Her first act as regent was vengeance. She had to eliminate the man who killed Dayan's father, Ismail Taishi. Mandukhai did not rule from the rear. She personally took command of the military, coordinating with allies from the Keshiktan tribe. She launched a sweeping campaign to hunt down Ismail. The historical records credit her with a glorious victory. She smashed Ismail's forces, shattering his grip on the court. Ismail was forced to flee to Hami, where he was eventually killed by local factions, either Muslims or Turkic groups. This victory was decisive. It allowed Mandukhai to reclaim control over the right-wing tribes and consolidate absolute military authority. She had saved the boy, crushed the usurper, and cleared the board for the great wars to come. With the internal traitors purged and the eastern tribes largely unified under the banner of the Borjigin, Mandukhai turned her gaze toward the setting sun. The east was safe, but the west remained a storm front. The Oirats, the Western Mongol Confederation, were the traditional rivals of the Genghisid line. These were the fierce, independent tribes that had once captured the Chinese emperor and had spent decades dictating terms to the golden lineage. They did not fear a female ruler, nor did they respect her boy husband, Dayan Khan. To the Oirat chieftains, the new regime was a joke, and they continued to raid the borders, refusing to submit to the central authority. Mandukhai understood the brutal calculus of the steppe. A Khan who cannot defend his borders is no Khan at all. If the Oirats were not broken, the unification of Mongolia would remain a fantasy. By this time, the timeline of history had moved forward. Dayan Khan was no longer the sickly child Mandukhai had rescued from the wilderness. He had grown into a young man, roughly 19 years old. Mandukhai, now in her 30s, had fulfilled the second half of her oath at the shrine she had officially married him. This union legitimized his rule and secured the succession. But even as a wife, Mandukhai did not retreat to the domestic sphere. The historical records paint a vivid picture of her during this period. Not in silk robes, but in mail and leather. She is described as wearing a helmet and wielding a sword, an image that defied every convention of her gender and era. She was the commander-in-chief in all but name. The conflict came to a head at a place called Tasird. It was here that Mandukhai launched a massive offensive to crush the Oirat resistance once and for all. But as the armies gathered, A complication arose that would have sidelined any other commander in history. Mandukhai was pregnant. In any other court, in any other nation, the queen would have been confined to her bed, surrounded by midwives. Far from the front lines, Mandukhai refused. She knew that her physical presence was the glue holding the Eastern army together. She rode out to Tasird, heavy with child, leading the charge against the most feared cavalry on the steppe. The Battle of Tasird was a chaotic, bloody affair. The Oirat's fought with the desperation of men who knew their era of dominance was ending. Amidst the clash of steel and the thunder of hooves, Mandukhai went into labor. The legend of what happened next is seared into the memory of the Mongol people. Mandukhai did not retire to a medical tent. She did not flee the field. She dismounted her horse amidst the carnage and, right there on the hard ground of the battlefield, she gave birth to twin boys. It was a moment of primal survival, but the true miracle was her resolve. She did not rest. She wrapped the newborn infants and placed them in padded saddlebags, one balancing the other on the flanks of her mount. Then, exhausted, bleeding, and driven by a will of iron, she climbed back into the saddle. Imagine the sight that greeted the Eastern Mongol warriors. Their Khatun, having just given birth in the middle of a war zone, was back on her horse, sword in hand, charging back into the fray with the future of the dynasty strapped to her saddle. It was a display of ferocity that transcended courage. It galvanized her troops into a frenzy. They fought not just for a Khan, but for the warrior mother who bled for them. The Oirat lines crumbled under the assault. Mandukhai didn't just win the battle. She broke the spirit of the Western tribes, securing a victory that would reshape the map of Mongolia. The dust had settled at Tasird, the Oirat war machine, which had terrorized the steppe for nearly a century, lay broken. But Mandukhai knew that winning a battle is not the same as winning a war. She had defeated their bodies. But to secure the future of the Borhigan line, she had to break their spirit. She needed to dismantle the Oirat identity and rebuild it in a shape that would forever be subservient to the golden lineage. Standing victorious on the battlefield, the warrior mother did not order a massacre. She ordered a rewriting of the social contract. She imposed the four great laws upon the defeated Western Mongols. These were not just bureaucratic rules. They were acts of psychological warfare designed to remind the Oirats of their defeat every single day. First, she attacked their vanity. The Oirat warriors were famous for their elaborate, plumed helmets that added to their terrifying stature. Mandukhai decreed that no Oirat could wear a helmet crest longer than 2 fingers. It was a visual castration, stripping them of their martial glory and marking them instantly as lesser warriors compared to the Eastern Mongols. Second, she attacked their pride. She forbade them from calling their personal tents orden or palaces. That word was now reserved exclusively for the golden lineage. Third, she enforced submission. For generations, the Oirat chieftains had sat cross-legged in the presence of the Khan, treating him as an equal. Mandukhai ended this. She decreed that Oirats must kneel before the Khan. And finally, it's the most bizarre and humiliating law of all. She forbade the Oirats from using knives to cut their meat. They were forced to tear the meat with their teeth. While some historians suggest this was a practical measure to disarm the population of personal daggers, symbolically, it reduced a proud people to the status of animals feeding at the master's table. With the West pacified and humiliated, Mandukhai turned her eyes back to her own people. The external war was won. Now she had to fix the internal rot. The old system of independent warlords had nearly destroyed the empire. Mandukhai and Dayan Khan burned that system to the ground. They introduced the 6 Tumans, the 6 10,000s. This was a radical centralization of power. The empire was divided into 2 wings. The left wing, comprising the Chahar, Khalkha, and Uryankai tribes, reported directly to the Khan. The right wing, the Ordos, Tumed, and Yungsi-Yebu tribes, reported to the Janong, or viceroy. But Mandukhai did not trust this new machine to strangers. She fueled it with her own blood. As the mother of 7 sons and 3 daughters, She systematically placed her own children as the governors and chieftains of these tumans. The Mongol Empire ceased to be a confederation of rivals. It became a family business. By the time the sun set on the 15th century, Mandukhai had not just conquered the steppe, she had reorganized it, stabilized it, and populated it. The Dark Age was officially over. The Great Yuan had returned. With the Oirats broken and the six tumans united under her sons, Mandukhai turned her eyes toward the final frontier, the south. The restoration of the Northern Yuan Dynasty under Mandukhai and Dian Khan had sent shockwaves of terror through the Ming court in Beijing. For a century, the Chinese emperors had slept soundly, believing the Mongol threat was a thing of the past. But now, they faced a unified, organized, and hungry power on their northern border. The Ming response was economic warfare. The Chinese tightened their trade embargoes, shutting down the border markets and refusing to trade tea, silk, and most critically iron for Mongol horses. They hoped to starve the steppe economy into submission. Mandukhai did not beg for trade. She took what she needed. She and Dian Khan launched a series of devastating, high-tempo military campaigns into the borderlands, specifically targeting the strategic Ordos Loop within the bend of the Yellow River. These were not the chaotic raids of bandits, they were the coordinated strikes of a professional army. The effectiveness of Mandukhai's command forced a total strategic shift in China. The Ming emperor realized that his armies could not defeat this resurrected Mongol cavalry in open expeditions. Instead, the Ming dynasty began to pour millions of taels of silver into defense. They expanded and reinforced the massive stone fortifications we know today as the Great Wall. The towering brick ramparts that tourists visit near Beijing are not just a monument to engineering, they are a monument to fear, specifically the fear of Mandukhai. By recapturing the Ordos region and stationing her troops there, she had placed a knife at the throat of the Chinese capital, forcing a superpower into a permanent defensive crouch. Mandukhai Sechen Khatun died around 1525. She was roughly 61 or 62 years old, a remarkable age for a woman who had lived her life in the saddle. The cause of her death remains a subject of debate, folklore, and dramatic retellings, like the film Queen Mandukhai the Wise, often suggest she was assassinated by Ming spies or a jealous concubine. However, serious historians and reliable sources point to a quieter, a more natural conclusion. She likely died of exhaustion. After decades of relentless warfare and bearing 8 children late in life, her body simply gave out, like Genghis Khan before her. Her grave has never been found, adding a final layer of mystery to her legend. But she does not need a stone monument. Her true legacy is written in blood, through her 7 sons. She became the matriarch of the entire Mongolian nobility for the centuries that followed. Figures like Altan Khan, who made Tibetan Buddhism the state religion, and Ligdan Khan, the last great Khan, all trace their lineage directly to her. She had succeeded in her impossible task. She had resurrected the Borhigan line from the dead. In the final analysis, Mandukhai Sechen Khatun was not merely a supporting character in the story of Dian Khan. She was the architect of the entire Northern Yuan Renaissance. In a nomadic society that valued male strength above all else, she shattered every glass ceiling through pure intellect. Her title Sechen means the wise and extraordinary courage. The image of her remains one of the most potent in military history, a pregnant queen in full armor, leading a cavalry charge to save her people, then imposing strict laws upon the vanquished. She took a dying empire and a sick 7-year-old orphan, and she turned them into a force that rebuilt a nation and redrew the map of Asia. Mandukhai stands tall as one of the greatest warrior queens, not just of Mongolia, but of the world, the woman who saved the last Khan. When the dust settles on the history of the 15th century, and the names of the great Ming emperors and Oirat warlords fade into the archives, one figure remains standing, not because of the monuments she built, but because of the civilization she saved. Mandukhai Sechen Khatun forces us to rethink the very nature of power. In the history books, often written by and for men, Power is usually measured in cities burned and enemies conquered. But Mandukhai offers a different definition. True power is the will to endure when the entire world wants you dead. Consider the alternative. If Mandukhai had chosen the easy path in 1479, if she had married General Unibold for safety and let the sick boy Batmonk perish in the wilderness, the Mongol identity would likely have evaporated. The tribes would have dissolved into petty fiefdoms, swallowed by the rising powers of Central Asia, or absorbed into the Chinese sphere of influence. There would be no Mongolia on the map today. That nation exists, quite literally, because one woman refused to give up. Her story resonates because it is not a fairy tale. It is a survival epic. She did not inherit a golden age. She inherited a graveyard. She faced treason, poverty, disease, and war. And she met them all with a sword in one hand and a child in the other. She reminds us that the hand that rocks the cradle can, indeed, to rule the world, and sometimes it must also wield the blade to protect it. So, the next time you see an image of the Great Wall of China winding endlessly over the mountains, remember why those stones were laid. They do not just stand as a testament to engineering, they stand as a silent, enduring tribute to the fear that one woman struck into the heart of a superpower. Mandukhai found a dying ember in the ashes of the Dark Ages, shielded it with her body, and fanned it into a flame that burned for 300 years. In a world written by men, Mandukhai the Wise wrote her own destiny, and in doing so, she became the eternal mother of a nation. History is filled with forgotten legends, but some stories are too important to lose. Mandukhai's life is a testament to resilience, strategy, and the unbreakable bond of family. If this story of the warrior queen who saved the last Khan resonated with you, help us keep these histories alive. Share this story, and join us next time as we uncover another lost chapter of the past. Until then, remember, history is not just what happened, it's who survived to tell it.